Bewitched captured the world's heart with its whimsical charm, but behind the iconic nose twitch lies a dark history of real-life suffering. Off-screen, many of its stars were battling secret addictions, hidden illnesses, and a series of cursed coincidences. Join us as we reveal the tragic fates and shocking transformations of the cast members you thought you knew. Dick York as Darren Stevens. To begin with, we turn to Dick York, who played Darren Stevens, the human husband constantly trying to survive a world of magic he never asked for. He was 36 years old when he became the grounded center of the show, the one character who made the fantasy feel real and relatable. More than anything, he was the emotional anchor that balanced the entire story. Sadly, Dick York died at 63 on February 20th, 1992, from complications of emphysema after spending years struggling to breathe and relying on oxygen tanks. He passed away in a hospital in Michigan and was buried at Plainfield Cemetery, far from the Hollywood spotlight that once defined him. The tragedy actually began years earlier, in 1959, during the filming of They Came to Cordura. In a single moment, while lifting what he thought was manageable weight, he suddenly bore the full load of a 180-pound actor, tearing the muscles along his spine. That injury never healed. By the time Bewitched became a hit, he was already living in constant pain, secretly relying on heavy painkillers just to stand, walk, and perform. By season 3, the pain had worsened so badly that the production had to build leaning walls for him to rest against between takes. Scripts were rewritten so Darren could remain sitting or lying down, and in multiple episodes he didn't appear at all. Then came the breaking point. During the filming of season 5, he collapsed on set with a fever over 40 degrees Celsius, suffering seizures so violent he bit through his own tongue before losing consciousness. And after that, everything fell apart. In 1969, he was forced to leave the show permanently, replaced without ever returning. The next 18 months of his life were spent mostly bedridden, heavily dependent on prescription drugs, battling addiction, hallucinations, and unbearable pain. He once described hearing bagpipes in his head day and night with no escape. By the early 1980s, his career had completely faded, with only brief appearances in Simon & Simon and Fantasy Island before retiring in 1984. Yet even in that condition, he founded a charity called Acting for Life, using nothing but a telephone from his bed to help the homeless. His net worth at the end was $500,000, largely consumed by years of medical costs. Elizabeth Montgomery as Samantha Stevens. Next is Elizabeth Montgomery, who played Samantha Stevens, the loving wife and magical mother at the heart of Bewitched. She was 31 years old when she became the emotional backbone of the entire series, shaping its warmth and identity across television. More than just a lead, she was the figure that held the entire show together. Sadly, Elizabeth Montgomery passed away at 62 on May 18, 1995, after a late-diagnosed colon cancer that had already spread to her liver. She chose to leave the hospital and return to her Beverly Hills home, where she died surrounded by Robert Foxworth and her 3 children. Her body was cremated, and a memorial was held on June 18, 1995, at the Cannon Theater, where even close friends admitted they couldn't fully express the loss. What makes her story far more unsettling is how much was already breaking behind the scenes long before her illness. Her marriage to William Asher, the creator of Bewitched, produced 3 children. But by the 8th season, she had begun an affair with director Richard Michaels. That relationship didn't just end a marriage in 1973, it also marked the slow collapse of the show itself, with tension rising on set and the series ending shortly after in 1972. At the same time, she was trying to escape Samantha's image, taking on darker roles like A Case of Rape, 1974, and The Legend of Lizzie Borden, 1975. And even in her final years, she kept pushing forward. In 1995, just weeks before her death, she completed Deadline for Murder, from the files of Edna Buchanan, ignoring flu-like symptoms during filming that later turned out to be cancer. Her last work even aired after her passing, including a voice role in Batman, the animated series. What makes this even more haunting is that her private life remained complicated until the end, including reported relationships overlapping during her long partnership with Foxworth. She left behind a legacy of reinvention, not just fame. She left behind a net worth estimated at around $20 million. Agnes Moorehead as Endora. Then, we come to Agnes Moorehead, who played Endora, the powerful and defiant mother whose presence dominated every scene she entered. At 63 years old, she became the driving force of the show's tension and unpredictability. More than a supporting role, she was the energy that kept the series alive. Sadly, Agnes Moorehead died at 73 on April 30th, 1974, at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota after battling uterine cancer. She was buried in a crypt at Dayton Memorial Park in Ohio, leaving behind a legacy shaped by both brilliance and mystery. But behind that commanding image was a life filled with contradictions and quiet isolation. Despite earning 4 Academy Award nominations and appearing in Citizen Kane, 1941, she struggled with deeply personal instability. She went through 2 failed marriages, first to John Griffith Lee, then to Robert Gist, and had no biological children. Even more striking, her will explicitly stated that she had no children at all, effectively cutting off her adopted son, Sean Lee. At the same time, rumors about her sexuality followed her for decades, fueled by co-stars like Paul Lynde, yet she never confirmed anything, choosing silence over explanation. Then comes the most disturbing part of her story, one that still raises questions today. In 1956, she filmed The Conqueror near a nuclear testing site in Utah. Out of approximately 220 cast and crew members, 91 later developed cancer and 46 died from it, including John Wayne, Susan Hayward, and director Dick Powell. Agnes Moorehead was among them. By the early 1970s, her health had visibly declined, forcing her to leave productions like Gigi in 1973 due to illness. What makes this even more haunting is how quietly it all unfolded. Her net worth was estimated at around $2 million. David White as Larry Tate. Now we turn to David White, who played Larry Tate, the powerful boss and advertising executive who constantly pushed Darren to succeed. He was 48 years old when he became the authority figure that drove much of the show's conflict and ambition. More than a boss, he was the pressure that kept the story moving. Tragically, David White died at 74 on November 27, 1990, from a heart attack in North Hollywood, just 2 years after a tragedy that shattered him completely. He was buried leaving behind only his daughter, after losing the one person he could never recover from. After his death, people knew that success never protected him from loss. In 1958, his first wife, Mary Welch, died from complications during pregnancy, a blow that already left a permanent mark on his life. But nothing compared to what came decades later. On December 21, 1988, his only son, Jonathan White, was killed at age 33 in the Pan Am Flight 103 bombing over Lockerbie, Scotland, one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in aviation history. The character of Larry Tate had even named his on-screen baby after Jonathan, making the loss feel even more personal and impossible to escape. And after that, everything seemed to fade. Despite a long career with appearances in The Twilight Zone, Perry Mason, Dallas, and films like The Apartment, 1960, and Sweet Smell of Success, 1957, he never truly returned to form. His final role came in 1986, just 2 years before his son's death, and by 1990, his heart gave out. Many believe not just from age, but from grief that never healed. He left behind a net worth estimated at around $1 million. Dick Sargent, as Darren Stevens. Then we move to Dick Sargent, who played Darren Stevens, the replacement husband stepping into one of the most controversial roles in television history. At 39 years old, he took over the role, carrying the weight of comparison that few actors could survive. From that moment on, he wasn't just playing Darren. He was living in someone else's shadow. Sadly, Dick Sargent died at 64 on July 8, 1994, after a long battle with prostate cancer that had worsened significantly by early 1994. His body was cremated, and his passing came less than a year before Elizabeth Montgomery's own death, creating an eerie connection between two co-stars tied by the same show. But what made his life even more difficult wasn't just professional pressure. It was the life he was forced to hide. Throughout the peak of his career in the 1960s and 70s, Sargent was a closeted gay man in an industry that could destroy careers over the truth. For decades, he lived in fear, carefully protecting his identity while enduring constant comparison to Dick York, with audiences openly rejecting him at first. Even though he had built a steady career with roles in Gunsmoke, The Dukes of Hazzard, and later projects like Columbo and Knots Landing, he was never fully accepted as the real Darren. And then, after years of silence, he made a decision that shocked many. In 1991, during National Coming Out Day, he publicly revealed he was gay. Not for attention, but to support young people struggling with their identity and high suicide rates. It was a brave move, especially as his health was already declining. By then, he had been living with his partner for years, after losing a previous partner to a brain hemorrhage in 1979. Even as cancer slowly took over, he continued advocacy work with AIDS organizations and LGBTQ+ causes. His net worth was estimated at around $1.5 million, but his final years were defined far more by courage than by fame. Alice Pierce as Gladys Kravitz. We come to Alice Pierce, who played Gladys Kravitz, the nosy neighbor whose frantic suspicions brought some of the show's most memorable comedy. At 47 years old, she became the voice of chaos across the street, turning disbelief into one of the show's most iconic running gags. More than comic relief, she was the spark that made the magic feel real. Sadly, Alice Pierce died at just 48 on March 3, 1966, from ovarian cancer, less than 2 months after filming her final episode on January 21, 1966. She had kept her diagnosis completely secret, continuing to work while her body was already failing. After her death, she was cremated and her ashes were scattered at sea. What makes this even more shocking is how long she carried that burden alone. Before Bewitched even began in 1964, she had already been diagnosed with terminal cancer. During filming, her rapid weight loss became visible, but she refused to stop working. Every exaggerated reaction, every frantic accusation as Gladys Kravitz was performed while she was enduring late-stage illness. And yet, no one on set fully understood the extent of what she was going through. And in a twist that feels almost too cruel, recognition came only after she was gone. She was awarded a Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Supporting Actress, posthumously, for the very role she fought to continue playing until the end. Her husband accepted the award on her behalf, standing there without her. With a net worth estimated at around $500,000, Alice Pierce left behind something far more lasting. George Tobias as Abner Kravitz. We have George Tobias, who played Abner Kravitz, the exhausted husband constantly trying to dismiss the chaos his wife insisted was real. He was 63 years old when he became the quiet, skeptical counterbalance to Gladys, grounding the show's most absurd moments. He wasn't loud, but without him, that dynamic wouldn't have worked at all. But his life ended with a strange and almost unsettling twist. George Tobias died at 78 on February 27, 1980, from bladder cancer at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was later buried in Queens, New York, but what happened in between still shocks people. On the way to the morgue, The vehicle carrying his body was stolen and driven several blocks before the thieves realized what was inside and fled the scene in panic. And yet, his life before that moment was marked by a very different kind of loneliness. Despite a long career that included major films like Sergeant York, 1941, Yankee Doodle Dandy, 1942, and roles alongside stars like James Cagney and Gary Cooper, Tobias never married and had no known children. He dedicated his entire life to acting, starting on stage at just 15 and eventually transitioning into film and television, where he became a familiar face in countless productions, including The Twilight Zone and Perry Mason. His role in Bewitched from 1964 to 1971 became his most recognized, yet it was only a small part of a career that spanned decades. And in the end, it all faded quietly. After retiring in 1977, he lived out his final years away from the spotlight, with no family of his own to surround him. Even his final journey, marked by that bizarre theft, felt strangely symbolic of a life that never quite fit into a simple narrative. His net worth was estimated at around $500,000, but his story remains one of the most quietly haunting among the entire cast. Sandra Gould as Gladys Kravitz. Next, we look at Sandra Gould, who played Gladys Kravitz, the loud, suspicious neighbor constantly watching from across the street. She was 50 years old when she stepped into the role, carrying the difficult task of keeping one of the show's most iconic characters alive after a tragic loss. And somehow, she didn't just replace it. She reshaped it in her own unforgettable way. Sadly, Sandra Gould passed away at 82 on July 20th, 1999, after suffering a stroke following heart surgery in Burbank, California. Her body was cremated, and her ashes were returned to her son. Before her death, the shadow she had to live came from the very beginning. She didn't originate the role, she inherited it after Alice Pierce's death from ovarian cancer in March 1966. At first, producers weren't even sure if Gladys Kravitz should continue at all, briefly introducing a different character before deciding to bring her back. When Gould finally took over in Season 3, she faced immediate comparison, stepping into a role tied directly to tragedy. Yet, through her exaggerated voice, sharp timing, and almost theatrical energy, she slowly made the character her own, continuing until Season 7 and even reprising the role in Tabitha in 1977. And beyond that role, she had spent decades building a career that most people overlooked. From early uncredited film appearances in T-Men, 1947, and Romance on the High Seas, 1948, to radio fame as Miss Duffy on Duffy's Tavern for 4 years, she had already lived an entire career before Bewitched. She continued working steadily afterward, appearing in shows like The Twilight Zone, I Dream of Jeannie, and even later in Friends. Her net worth was estimated at around $800,000, modest, but built on a lifetime of persistence in an industry that rarely made space for her. Marion Lorne as Aunt Clara. Now we turn to Marion Lorne, who played Aunt Clara, the kind, forgetful elderly relative whose magic never quite worked the way it should. She was 81 years old when she became one of the most beloved and fragile presences in the series, bringing warmth and quiet humor unlike anyone else. More than a side character, she was the gentle soul that gave the show its emotional softness. Sadly, Marion Lorne died at 84 on May 9, 1968, from a heart attack in her Manhattan apartment, just days before receiving the biggest recognition of her career. She was later buried at Ferncliff Cemetery in New York, while the award she had unknowingly earned was accepted after her death. The deeper you look into her life, the more tragic the timing becomes. She had spent decades on stage, debuting on Broadway as early as 1905 and running her own theater in London, where none of her productions lasted fewer than 125 performances. Yet true recognition didn't come until late in life, when she appeared in Strangers on a Train, 1951, and later in television shows like Mr. Peepers. By the time she found widespread fame as Aunt Clara, she was already in her 80s, a rare and almost unheard-of rise in Hollywood. And then, just as everything finally came together, it ended. She appeared in only 27 episodes before her sudden death, and producers refused to recast her role, choosing instead to quietly remove Aunt Clara from the story altogether. Her Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Supporting Actress was awarded posthumously, accepted by Elizabeth Montgomery. She left behind a net worth estimated at around $300,000. Alice Ghostly as Esmeralda. Next is Alice Ghostly, who played Esmeralda, the shy, clumsy housemaid witch trying her best to help the Stevens family. She was 46 years old when she stepped into a role that quietly filled the emotional gap left behind in the series and kept its magical charm alive. Instead of replacing a character, she softened the transition and became a new kind of comfort for the audience. Sadly, Alice Ghostly passed away at 84 on September 21, 2007, at her home in Studio City, California, after a long battle with colon cancer and a series of debilitating strokes. Her husband of 50 years, Felice Orlandi, had died just 4 years earlier in 2003, leaving her to face those final years largely alone. She was laid to rest quietly, with little public attention despite a lifetime in the spotlight. What truly makes her story striking is how long she had to wait to be seen. She left university early to chase acting, debuting on Broadway in New Faces of 1952, then slowly building a career across decades with roles in To Kill a Mockingbird, 1962, and countless television appearances like Car 54, Where Are You, and The Julie Andrews Hour. Even after winning a Tony Award and earning an Emmy nomination in 1992 for Designing Women, she was often cast as the odd, overlooked woman, her talent recognized but rarely fully celebrated. And yet, despite all that, she never stopped working. From Grease to The Golden Girls and even Sabrina the Teenage Witch in her later years, she remained a familiar face across generations. Her character Esmeralda appeared in just 15 episodes, but left a lasting impression that proved she didn't need screen time to matter. With a net worth estimated at around $1.2 million, Alice Ghostly's legacy is not about fame. It's about quiet persistence in a career that never truly gave her everything she deserved. Paul Lynde as Uncle Arthur. Moving on, we talk about Paul Lynde, who played Uncle Arthur, the mischievous, sarcastic uncle whose humor cut through every scene he entered. He was 39 years old when he became the unpredictable spark of the show, turning even small appearances into unforgettable moments. More than comic relief, he was the chaos that audiences couldn't get enough of. But behind that laughter was a life far more complicated. Paul Lynde died at 55 on January 10, 1982, from a heart attack at his home in Beverly Hills, discovered alone in his bed the following morning. His ashes were buried in Ohio beside members of his family, bringing his story back to where it began. By the time you understand what he was dealing with, the story takes a darker turn. Despite becoming one of the most recognizable faces on television through Bewitched and Hollywood Squares from 1968 to 1981, he lived in constant internal conflict. As a closeted gay man in an unforgiving era, he masked that pressure with humor, often turning himself into the joke before anyone else could. At the same time, he struggled heavily with alcohol, leading to repeated arrests in the 1970s, including a 1978 incident in Salt Lake City for public intoxication and disorderly conduct. And the darker moments didn't stop there. In 1965, a close friend fell to his death from a hotel window after hours of drinking with Lynde, an incident that haunted him for years, even though it was ruled accidental. His behavior became increasingly erratic, with reports of him turning cruel or volatile when intoxicated, alienating even those closest to him. Though he managed to get sober in the early 1980s, it came too late. With a net worth estimated at around $2 million, Paul Lynde left behind a legacy of laughter, but also a life marked by loneliness, pressure, and a silence he was never truly allowed to break. Maurice Evans as Maurice, father of Samantha. Now we turn to Maurice Evans, who played Maurice, Samantha's proud, controlling father who never quite trusted the mortal world. At 63 years old, he brought a commanding, almost theatrical intensity to the series, making every appearance feel larger than life. His presence didn't just add conflict, it elevated the show's sense of power and hierarchy. Tragically, Maurice Evans died at 87 on March 12, 1989, in a nursing home in Rottingdean, East Sussex, England, due to heart failure complicated by a bronchial infection. After decades of commanding stages and screens, he spent his final years in relative isolation, having never married and leaving no direct heirs. His passing marked the quiet fading of one of the last great classical actors of his generation. The reality behind his career is what makes his story so unexpected. Long before television fame, Evans was one of the most respected Shakespearean actors of the 20th century, performing Hamlet on Broadway across 4 separate runs, totaling 283 performances, a record that few actors have ever matched. He also served in the U.S. Army during World War II, organizing over 100 entertainment shows for troops in the Pacific, even helping launch the career of Carl Reiner along the way. Yet despite this legacy, later critics, including Orson Welles, openly dismissed his acting style as outdated and overly theatrical. And in the end, that contrast defined him. He appeared in major films like Planet of the Apes, 1968, as Dr. Zaius and Rosemary's Baby the same year, proving his range extended far beyond the stage. But as Hollywood changed, his classical approach slowly faded out of demand, leaving him somewhat out of place in a new era. With an estimated net worth of around $3 million, Maurice Evans left behind a legacy of brilliance, but also a reminder of how even the greatest talents can be quietly left behind by time. Bernard Fox as Dr. Bombay. Finally, we come to Bernard Fox, who played Dr. Bombay, the eccentric, unreliable doctor summoned through magic who often made things even worse. He was 39 years old when he became one of the show's most unpredictable comedic elements, turning every appearance into controlled chaos. His character didn't fix problems. He exposed how fragile magic really was. But his real ending was far quieter than the laughter he brought. Bernard Fox passed away at 89 on December 14, 2016, from heart failure at Valley Presbyterian Hospital in Van Nuys, California. He left behind a wife and 2 daughters, closing the chapter of one of the last surviving adult members of the Bewitched cast. His passing marked the end of a generation that had quietly carried classic television for decades. The surprising part is how vast his career truly was behind that one role. Born into a 5th-generation acting family, Fox had already lived multiple lives before fame, serving in the Royal Navy during both World War II and the Korean War, then appearing in over 30 films between 1956 and 2004. He was one of the rare actors to appear in 2 Titanic films nearly 40 years apart, first in A Night to Remember, 1958, delivering the iconic warning, "Iceberg right ahead," and later in Titanic, 1997, as Colonel Archibald Gracie IV, a role that reintroduced him to a global audience. And yet, despite that range, he was often remembered for brief comedic roles rather than leading performances. From Hogan's Heroes to The Andy Griffith Show and even Disney's The Rescuers, he moved constantly between projects without ever being fully defined by one. His portrayal of Dr. Bombay appeared in only 18 episodes, but became unforgettable precisely because it felt so effortless. With a net worth estimated at around $1.5 million, Bernard Fox left behind a career built not on fame, but on consistency, longevity, and quiet impact. So after looking back at how these bewitched cast members tragically passed away, it's hard not to see the show in a completely different light. Behind the laughter and magic were lives filled with quiet struggles, unexpected endings, and stories that still linger long after the final episode. Which story shocked you the most, and whose journey affected you the deepest? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.